Thank you very much. Not only is my wife Canadian, but on July 1st, she hangs the largest Canadian flag she could find in front of our house in Princeton, New Jersey, and leaves it up through July 4th. And this year, I actually heard the brother of the woman who lives next door, because she does this every year, walk in the driveway to his sister's house and say, "Fucking Canadians." So I guess that makes me an honorary Canadian. I have spent the last 2 years writing this book with Joe Sacco. I don't know how many of you know Joe's work. In my mind, he's one of the most brilliant journalists in the United States. He's actually Maltese. We had met in Bosnia in 1995, where he was working on a book called Garazda, a safe area, and subsequently did a couple magazine pieces together, one for Harper's. We went to Gaza, wrote a piece called a Gaza Diary, where we lived in a refugee camp for 10 days, Han Yunis. And in the course of that reporting, ran into survivors from the 100-day Israeli occupation of Gaza in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. And during that 100-day occupation on the part of the IDF, hundreds of young Palestinian men were summarily rounded up and executed in Han Yunis and in Rafah. And if you know the history of Hamas, and I knew very well Dr. Rantisi, one of the leaders of Hamas, before the Israelis killed him in a targeted assassination, as I also knew Nizar Rayan, who was also killed along with all of his children in an Israeli targeted assassination in 2008 at his home. It was Rantisi standing in Han Yunis watching relatives of his, including an uncle, being gunned down by Israeli forces against the wall, that drove him into the Muslim Brotherhood and eventually led to Hamas. An absolutely vital moment in Palestinian history that few know. And Harper's cut that out, arguing that it was history, as if history doesn't have any bearing on the present. And it angered Joe so much that he went and spent the next 6 years of his life writing this amazing book called Footnotes in Gaza, where he went back to Gaza and found all the remaining survivors and reconstructed. And that is one of the great masterpieces of the Palestine-Israel conflict. Without question, one of the great books of the Palestine-Israel conflict. And the thing about Sacco that's incredible is that he functions as a journalist, and that's when I first met him. I'm not a reader of graphic novels particularly, but I know something about journalism, and I realized very quickly that he was a brilliant reporter, and then he draws it out. And of course, it's incredibly labor-intensive. Our work with Harper's, we later did a piece for The Nation magazine on Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States, and not surprisingly, this last year was the most dangerous in terms of the number of homicides. They don't quite know what to do with his work. And so we decided to do this collaboration. And this book really came out of previous work that I had done called Death of the Liberal Class. It was a history of the sort of how all of the pillars of the liberal society had been decimated and destroyed. It originally started out as a book about the press. I had been asked by a publisher, Knopf, if I would write, the collapse of the traditional press, in particular newsprint, and I originally didn't want to do it, and then was at an event at the Ford Foundation, and they said they'd fund it. And so I did write it, and it was a good lesson for me as a writer, and should be a good lesson for any of you who are writers, don't ever write somebody else's idea. Because when I turned the manuscript into Knopf, they read it and they hated it. And they said that they would publish it only after assigning an editor to take out what they called all the negativity in the book. Now, I actually believe that the collapse of the commercial media is detrimental to democracy, but I'm not about to cover up the sins of the corporate press, which I understand far better than the editors of Knopf. And so I frantically looked for another publisher to buy Knopf out. You get half your advance up front, and I got Nation Books to buy them out. I never got the other half. I just said, give them that half and you can have the book. And in that transition between publishers, I began to reflect on what had happened to the liberal establishment, that it wasn't just the press that had collapsed, but the Democratic Party, at least as a champion of the working class and the poor, labor, the liberal church, which I come out of, a culture which has become crass and commercialized garbage, largely in the United States. Authentic, real culture, the capacity to transform exists now totally on the margins of the American cultural scene. And of course, public education. And so I set out to write a book, a much broader book, that looked at what had happened. And it led me back to, I think, probably the most crucial moment in American history when everything changed for the worse. And that was World War I. On the eve of World War I, in the United States, we had 70 socialist mayors in the country, including in large cities like Milwaukee, Schenectady, and others. Eugene Debs, in 1912, the socialist presidential candidate, polled 900,000 votes, 6% of the vote. We had socialist publications like The Masses and Appeal to Reason, which had the fourth highest circulation in the country. And this was the culmination of a long and bitter struggle against a rapacious oligarchic class, the robber barons, who roughly since the age of Alexander Hamilton, all the way through, had created conditions of utter misery for working men and women and for the poor. It was an absolutely heartless, bankrupt system of capitalism. And if you know the history of the late 18th century and early 19th century, whether it's Ludlow or Homestead or anywhere else, a lot of working men and women paid with their lives to fight back against these forces. And what happened in World War I is that because there was no popular support for the war, indeed Wilson had run for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war," there was a problem in how to contain anti-war sentiment and mobilize a population that was not enthusiastic about entering the conflict. And you saw the rise of perhaps the darkest intellectual figure in certainly early 20th century history, and that's Walter Lippmann, who goes to Wilson and argues that Wilson immediately wants to pass the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act as a way to coerce, to crush the movements, to silence them, to shut down the publications, and to imprison. And Lippmann says, and he lays it all out in his book Public Opinion, which becomes the kind of blueprint for what he calls manufacturing consent. That's where, when Chomsky and Herman write their work, their great work on the press, that's where the term manufacturing consent comes from. It comes from Lippmann. And he argues that you can create a system of modern mass propaganda that seduces not only the masses, but the intellectual class. And so Lippmann wins the argument, and we see the establishment of the Committee for Public Information, known as the Creole Commission, headed by a former muckraking journalist named George Creole, that employs the understanding of crowd psychology pioneered by Le Bon, Trotter, and Sigmund Freud. Edward Bernays, the father of the modern public relations industry, worked for the Creole Commission. He was Freud's nephew through marriage twice over. And this was the comprehension that people were not moved by fact or reason, but by the skillful manipulation of emotion. And so you saw a massive sort of propaganda effort built around a news division that pumped out pro-war stories. All publications had to run those stories, or they had to shut down. That's why the masses did not publish during the war. You had its own film division that made movies like The Kaiser, The Butcher of Berlin, and this kind of stuff. And you had speakers bureaus, they called them 3-minute men, that were fanned out across the country, graphic artists. And Lippmann was right. And if you read those sort of independent intellectual voices that held out, Randolph Bourne or Jane Addams, there's a deep despair at how easily everyone, including the intelligentsia, is seduced behind the war effort. And the reason we went into the war was because of Wall Street. You saw the collapse late in the war of the Eastern Front, the capacity that the Kaiser potentially had to move up to 100 divisions to the Western Front, and if the French and the British were defeated, all the massive loans that the bankers on Wall Street had given to the British and the French would never be repaid. And so Wall Street pushed us into the war. And there's a social critic, a cultural critic that I like very much. He's not read much anymore, although he should be, Dwight MacDonald. Dwight MacDonald, for 5 years, ran a publication called Politics, never had a circulation above 5,000, but he published at the time Orwell, Hannah Arendt, Bruno Bettelheim. And if you know anything about Chomsky's trajectory or political awakening, he credits it to politics. And MacDonald, when he writes about this period, he says the war was the rock on which these progressive movements broke, because the war was essentially used as a way to seduce large sections of the intelligentsia along with the masses, and then those renegades who held out, like Eugene V. Debs, Debs ends up in prison by Wilson for opposing the draft. So the last sort of elements are picked off. And MacDonald, I think, makes another crucial point about World War I, and that is that the moment the war ended, and we saw the dreaded Hun become the dreaded Red, we entered a period which we still live in, which MacDonald calls a kind of psychosis of permanent war. And he says none of the political theorists of the 19th century, including Karl Marx, grappled with this concept of permanent war. Indeed, one of the few times Marx writes about war in the Franco-Prussian War is that he hopes the Prussians will win because it will accelerate the possibility of the workers' state. And when you enter what he calls the psychosis of permanent war, where you're constantly attempting to ferret out the internal as well as the external enemy, you have the capacity to disembowel, to destroy your liberal movements, your radical movements. And that's precisely what happened in the aftermath of World War I. You shut down the radical anarcho-syndicalist union, the Wobblies. Joe Hill is hung on trumped-up murder charges in Utah. Big Bill Haywood, again on trumped-up murder charges, has to flee the country, spends the last 10 years of his life miserably in exile. In Moscow, the masses is shut down, appeal to reason is shut down. That's when you get the deportations of Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, all in the name of anti-communism. Now, Chomsky, I think, for me, has sort of explained perhaps most presciently the role of the liberal class in a capitalist democracy. The role of the liberal class, Chomsky argues, I think correctly, is that it acts as a kind of safety valve to make incremental or piecemeal reform possible. It also sets the parameters by which acceptable debate is permissible. And Chomsky uses the Vietnam War as an example, although he could as easily use a war in Iraq where you are allowed to critique the excesses, but never the virtues of those who carry out that project. Once you attack the motives and the virtues of the power elite, you are immediately pushed out of the mainstream. And that, of course, is what's happened to Chomsky himself. I mean, Chomsky's greatest enemies in the United States are not the far right. They don't even know who he is. It's the liberal class, because Chomsky exposes their complicity with the power elite. The same with Nader. Nader is also a pariah. I mean, in Ralph's words, he's blacklisted. He can't even get on public radio, and that's right. And it's the liberal class which assumes this kind of moral veneer and yet is complicitous within the structure. And that's why they hate these radical movements. Now, Zinn, I teach in a prison, and unlike at a university, when I write my summaries of courses, I try and make them look absolutely as benign and boring as possible, because the inmates are a captive class, and the people who approve the courses are the prison administration. And so the class before this, the last class I taught was Leon Litwack's great works on Reconstruction and Jim Crow. But the class before that was just called American History, learning about our founding fathers and the values that made us a nation. And it was cleared by the prison administration. And then I went out and I bought every inmate a copy of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States. And it's incredibly moving to teach. I never met Zinn. I'm a huge admirer of Zinn. I know Henry knew him pretty well. But boy, teaching that book to African American inmates, because Zinn is really cognizant throughout the book of the African American experience, was really deeply moving. The first class I taught there, I tried to run it as a seminar, which was a complete disaster because somehow every class ended up being about the hood. So after that, I run the class like a Nazi, where it's a 90-minute talk, and you have to raise your hand. But I would be running through the Zinn, and I would hear inmates go, damn, we've been lied to. But Zinn, I think, laid out in that book a fundamental truth about the American political system. And that is that it was designed to empower an aristocratic or oligarchic white male landowning slave-holding elite. And every opening in American democracy was fought for by radical movements, whether that were abolitionists, whether that was labor, whether that was the suffragists, or whether finally that was the civil rights movement. And none of these movements ever took formal positions of power. And yet, of course, if you wanted to, you could make the argument that until he was assassinated in April of 1968, the most powerful political figure in the United States was Martin Luther King. Because when he went to Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. It's those movements that opened up the democratic space. And they had to fight against an entrenched power elite. I mean, think of all the people that were shut out of the constitutional conventions. African Americans, Native Americans. Go back and read Jefferson or Washington. An enthusiastic embrace of genocide of Native communities. Women, and of course people without property. And so the decimation of these movements in the wake of World War I began the unraveling that has led us to where we are today. Conrad Black, not a favorite figure of mine, but nevertheless, Conrad Black, when he writes his biography of Roosevelt, says that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism in the breakdown of capitalism in the 1930s. And that's right. That's what the liberal class does. Karl Popper writes about it in The Open Society and Its Enemies. Popper has a great line. He said, the question is not how do you get good people to rule. That's the wrong question. Most people attracted to power, according to Popper, are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Harper. The question is, how do you make the power elite frightened of you? That is the question. And you do that by creating movements that hold fast to moral imperatives. Julian Benda writes about this in his book, The Treason of Intellectuals, when he says that we all have a choice in life between serving two sets of principles, either privilege and power or justice and truth. But the more those of us who are committed to justice and truth make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more we diminish the capacity for justice and truth. And that was, I think, the failing of the left, certainly in my country, is that we forgot that it's not our job to take power. There's a great moment in Kissinger's memoirs, do not buy the book, where it's 1971, and there's a huge anti-war demonstration outside the White House, and Nixon, who, by the way, was our last liberal president, because he was still scared of movements. OSHA, the Mine and Safety Act, the Clean Water, all came under Nixon. So the White House is ringed with empty buses, and Nixon standing at a window with Kissinger, looking out, wringing his hands, going, Henry, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. And that's just where we want people in power to be. What happened in the United States, and I think we became sort of the worst example. I'm always amazed to come to Canada because we make every mistake and then like 10 years later you copy us. I've never figured it out. I don't get it. We shred Kyoto, then you shred Kyoto. I don't know. What happened in the United States is that in the 1950s we saw a final assault against what was left of not only radical movements but the liberal class. Because as the radical movements were destroyed in the name of anti-communism, and now of course it's the war on terror, the liberal institutions themselves were disemboweled. So in the 1950s, we saw thousands of high school teachers, university professors, journalists like I.F. Stone, that's one of our greatest investigative journalists, ends up becoming a pariah, can't get a job even at The Nation magazine, ends up starting I.F. Stone's weekly in his basement. Artists, singers, writers, directors, all purged in the name of communism. That's how Paul Robeson, he can't, by the end of his life, Paul Robeson can't even sing at African American churches. They take away his passport. He's not allowed to travel. And the way it happened, Ellen Schrecker has written a couple good books on this, No Ivory Tower, and I forget the name of the other, this historian, but the way it would happen is that the FBI would show up at a high school, they would have a list of teachers, no evidence would ever be presented, the teachers would be called in, they would lose their jobs, and they would never get another job. They'd be blackballed, they'd be blacklisted. And at that point, essentially, all of the mechanisms, the restraints on corporate capitalism that had been put in place as a kind of emergency stopgap measure by the New Deal were lifted. And we began to shift or move towards the Leviathan that we have become. We have undergone, in the words of John Ralston Saul, a coup d'etat in slow motion. So that by the 1970s, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, we change from what he calls an empire of production to an empire of consumption, i.e. we are borrowing both to maintain a lifestyle or a level of consumption and an empire we can no longer afford. And at that point, we begin to see the massive unraveling. Of course, wages in the United States have declined or remained stagnant since the early 1970s. There's a wonderful book by our greatest living political philosopher, Sheldon Wolin, called Democracy Incorporated. And in it, Wolin taught at Berkeley for many years and later Princeton. In it, Wolin argues that we live not in a capitalist democracy, but in a system that he calls inverted totalitarianism. And by that, he means it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in a classical totalitarian regime, you have a reactionary or a revolutionary force that overthrows a decaying structure and replaces it. In inverted totalitarianism, you have corporate forces that purport to pay fealty to the iconography and language of American patriotism, the Constitution, and electoral politics, and yet internally have seized all of the levers of power. The perfect example of that is so-called Obamacare, the Affordable Health Care Act, which was written by corporate lobbyists. Well, it was originally written by the Heritage Foundation, a right-wing think tank. It was first put into place by then-Governor Mitt Romney in Massachusetts, and then it was adopted by the Obama administration. We even know the name of the woman from Wellfleet who wrote it. She's now gone back, and she was working for Senator Max Baucus, who chaired the committee, now going back, making millions of dollars from the insurance industry. And that Obamacare package, which provides $447 billion in subsidies for the pharmaceutical and insurance industry, is essentially the same package. It's a kind of hall of mirrors. It's the same package. Obamacare was Romneycare. There is no difference. It's an absolutely faux debate. And of course, one of the first things that the White House had to do once it was passed was grant the insurance companies exemptions, because the insurance companies did not want to have to insure chronically ill children, which in moral terms means that I live in a country where it is legally permissible for corporations to hold sick children hostage while their parents bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughters. That what we began to see was the replacement of a traditional liberal elite with a kind of faux liberalism, which is really embodied first by Clinton. Bill Clinton, who passed NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of the working class in the United States since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1948, which makes it very difficult to organize. It was Clinton that destroyed our traditional welfare program, and it used to be that 70% of the recipients of the old welfare system were children. It was Clinton that deregulated the FCC, essentially turning and this is also something that I'm now watching in Canada. I had a brief exchange with Kevin O'Leary. You know, the kind of mutation that migrates from my country to yours. You have a half dozen corporations, Viacom, General Electric, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, Disney, Clear Channel, that control almost everything. 90+% of Americans listen to or watch. And it imposes a kind of bland uniformity of opinion. What Dorothy Parker once said about Katharine Hepburn's emotional range as an actress, it goes from A to B. Well, that's sort of what acceptable political debate within the United States passes for. It was Clinton that deregulated the banking system, creating, and whatever you think of Chrétien, he saved you by not ripping down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks. We have over 100 bank closures a year, precipitating not only the national but the global meltdown. And what did Clinton get for it? he got corporate money. So that by the 1990s, the Democratic Party has fundraising parity with the Republicans, and when Obama runs in 2008, they have more. And it's this kind of faux liberalism. I know Michael Ignatieff very well. I've known Michael for years. And for me, Michael embodied this kind of neoliberal stance, which speaks in the traditional feel your pain language of liberalism, and yet sells out the very constituency that the liberal class once purportedly defended. On the day the war started in Iraq, I was on a show called Fresh Air. And I was given whatever, segment, 12 and a half minutes or something, to argue against the war. And then the person who followed me was given exactly the same amount of time to argue why we should invade, in fact, was Ignatieff. And I like Michael. It's not a personal thing, but I remember my heart just sort of sinking because there were so few voices. Those of us who I spent 7 years in the Middle East, I speak Arabic, I spent tremendous amounts of time in Iraq, I understand the instrument of war. And again, it went back to that moment of World War I that Bourne and Jane Addams write about, where the numbers of people who don't become seduced shrink to such a tiny minority that they're easily disposed of, as I was. And I think for me, Obama has very effectively done precisely what Clinton did. Obama functions for the corporate state as a brand, the same way that Calvin Klein and Bennington a few years ago used to use HIV-positive models and people of color to associate their products with kind of a risque lifestyle and progressive politics. That's the function of Obama. Because the Obama administration has not only assiduously carried out the major structural issues of the Bush administration, there's been complete continuity, whether it's with Wall Street, whether it's with the expansion of drone attacks, or whether it's the assault on civil liberties, which is worse under Obama than under Bush. You have Obama, I think through a misinterpretation of the 2001 Authorization to Use Military Force Act, claiming that he has the right to assassinate American citizens. I'm speaking, of course, of Anwar al-Awlaki in Yemen, and then, of course, his teenage son 2 weeks later, 17-year-old son who was, as far as I know, never on any terrorism list at all. It is Obama that has embraced the FISA Amendment Act. The FISA Amendment Act was passed to retroactively make legal what under our Constitution has traditionally been illegal, the warrantless wiretapping, monitoring, and eavesdropping of tens of millions of Americans. And we now know that all of this information, all of our personal information is being stored out in these massive supercomputers in Utah. Why was it retroactive? Because when Verizon and Sprint and AT&T handed over all this personal information after 9/11 to the government, it was in direct violation of our constitutional rights to privacy. And there were cases working their way up in the lower court that they knew they would lose, and so they descended on Washington and granted themselves retroactive immunity. Obama has used the Espionage Act, passed by Wilson in 1917, 6 times to shut down whistleblowers within the government. And we just saw the first of them, Kiriakou, former CIA official, go to prison for 30 months. Now, the Espionage Act is our Foreign Secret Act. It was never designed to shut down whistleblowers. It was designed for people who gave foreign secrets to whatever country was considered the enemy. And Obama has, between 1917 and 2008, when Obama took power, it was used 3 times against whistleblowers, the first time being against Daniel Ellsberg. Obama's used it, of course, 6 times. And friends of mine who still do investigative reporting say that, in essence, no one within the government will speak to them, even on background, because they're terrified of going to jail. Essentially, you have shut down any narrative that is not the official narrative. And let's remember that many of these whistleblowers exposed war crimes, torture and abuse that was being committed by the US government. And finally, Obama, a year ago, signed into law Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. The National Defense Authorization Act, this section, overturning 200 years of domestic law, permits the US military to seize American citizens on American soil if they are deemed to have substantially supported. Now, that's not materially support, which has a legal definition. Substantially support is amorphous. Substantially supported the Taliban, Al-Qaeda, or something they call associated forces. Hold them in military facilities, including our offshore penal colonies. Strip them of due process and keep them, in the language of that section, until the end of hostilities. It's indefinite detention, of course. So I sued the president in federal court. I was joined in my lawsuit by Chomsky and Ellsberg and a few other activists. And last September, we won. Judge Catherine Forrest in the Southern District Court of New York ruled that that section of the NDA was unconstitutional. And in her 112-page opinion, she brought up the internment of 110,000 Japanese Americans in World War II. That essentially this gives the government the capacity to use the military to seize an entire section of the population, strip them of legal rights, and hold them in detention centers indefinitely. Now, the reaction of the Obama administration was very telling. We knew they'd appeal. Judge Forrest issued a ruling on a Friday morning. That Friday afternoon, the government attorneys were replaced by attorneys from the Pentagon. The Pentagon went to Judge Forrest and demanded an emergency stay, meaning the law has to be put back into effect until it can be appealed in the Second Circuit Appellate Court, which is where it is now. And Judge Forrest, to her credit, refused. So on Friday, late Friday afternoon, the government demanded an emergency hearing at 9 a.m. that next Monday morning at the appellate court in New York. It goes from the federal court to the appellate court to the Supreme Court, which they got. Argued on national security grounds that the law had to be put back into effect, which the appellate court granted them. Now, if they acted that aggressively, it is almost certain that it is because they're already detaining American citizens, probably dual Pakistani US nationals in places like Bagram. Because if the law was allowed to stand, if Judge Forrest's ruling was allowed to stand, and they were holding US citizens without granting them due process, they would be in contempt of court. And on February 6th, we will go in to hear oral arguments. And if the appellate court upholds Judge Forrest's ruling, it will be in the Supreme Court within a matter of weeks. When we wrote this book, we wanted to go to the sacrifice zones, those places within the United States which were first forced to kneel before the dictates of the marketplace. Places where there were no restraints or impediments to corporate capitalism. And of course, we begin where it all began, and that is with the indigenous communities, in particular the Western Plains, where the railroad companies and the timber merchants and the miners and the gold speculators and the land speculators wanted the land and took it, and of course decimated and slaughtered the indigenous communities that stood in their way. That's where the whole demented project of ceaseless exploitation and consumption began. And I find it that it's not just a matter of seizing the mineral wealth and the resources in the land, but it was also about destroying a competing ethic. Because indigenous communities lived communally. People who hoarded within indigenous communities were despised. Indigenous communities had a sense of the sacred. There's a wonderful book by the economist Karl Polanyi, 1944, called The Great Transformation. He taught at Columbia, but he lived in Toronto because the United States had deemed his wife, they were both from Hungary, a communist and wouldn't let her in the country. So he flew back every weekend to Toronto. But it's a book about unfettered capitalism. What happens when all restraints are lifted? And as Marx understood, capitalism becomes a revolutionary force. It commodifies everything. Human beings become commodities, and the natural world becomes a commodity that it then exploits until exhaustion or collapse. And that's precisely the force that we have unleashed. So that we lose 40% of the summer Arctic sea ice, and the response of the fossil fuel industry is to go up and drop drill bits, $500 million drill bits. The death throes of the planet is a business opportunity. It makes Herman Melville's Moby Dick the most prescient study of the American character, where we're all aboard the Pequod, and it's captained by Ahab, who says, "My means and my methods are sane, only my object is mad." And Polanyi actually uses the word sacred. He says that when societies lose the capacity for the sacred, when nothing has an intrinsic value, but everything has solely a monetary value, such societies cannibalize themselves until they die. And these are the forces that now stand before us, here and globally. We have created a system of neo-feudalism, global neo-feudalism, and I don't have to tell anyone who lives in Hamilton what I'm speaking about, where countries are played one off the other. Workers here and workers in the United States are told that they have to be competitive in a global marketplace, which means being competitive with sweatshop workers in Bangladesh who make 22 cents an hour or prison labor in China. And these forces are rapidly building a kind of international oligarchic cabal that replicates the power structure that Orwell laid out in his dystopian novel 1984, in the mythical nation of Oceania, where you have an inner party of 2 to 4%, an outer party of about 12, 14%. That's the corporate managers, the public relations, the security and surveillance apparatus, and then 85%, the rest are what he calls proles. That's the world we're creating. And that's why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis, because the same forces are at work, cannibalizing both internally countries, the business term is harvesting, both nations and the environment in this final, last, desperate plunge downwards. So when we go to Pine Ridge, or when we go to the coal fields of southern West Virginia, and boy, I'll tell you, Joe and I flew over the Appalachians, and it'll rip your heart out. Hundreds of thousands of acres destroyed. And because they don't want to dig down for coal, they just blow the top 400 feet off the mountains. The air is poisoned, the water is poisoned. We went into some of these old hollows, coal camps, and everybody in the town has had their gallbladder removed. You turn on the taps and the water's fetid, smells like sulfur. You go into elementary school in the nurse's office, and there's rows of little inhalers because all the kids can't breathe. And what happened in southern West Virginia, what happened in Camden, which was once a great industrial center, what happens in the nation's produce fields or in Immokalee, Florida, is now happening to the rest of us. And as Bernie Sanders said when he went to Immokalee, which is, we went to Florida because there was the worst labor laws in the country. I mean, for example, legally it is, collective bargaining is legal in Florida, but you can fire a worker for attempting to organize and they have no legal recourse. So it essentially invalidates the capacity to have collective bargaining. That's where you begin to see what you've always seen in the produce industry going back from the time of emancipation, and that's slavery. So that we actually, in the book, interview a worker who for 2 years was kept in the back, chained at night in the back of a truck with other workers, forced to defecate in a corner of the truck. Finally, after 2 years, 3 of the workers punch a hole in the roof, get the police, they raid the place, but none of the workers want to testify against the crew leaders because they've warned them that if they do, their families back in Mexico, Honduras, or Guatemala will be killed. This worker testifies, and what happens is he becomes blacklisted. They show up every morning at 4 o'clock to get on the buses to go out and pick it. No one will pick it. And when we find him, he's an alcoholic, sleeping literally outside under a mango tree. And those conditions of slavery are now being replicated in the hotel industry, in the meatpacking industry, because there are no defenses left. The book was always called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, but revolt was a conjecture. It was an understanding that the impediments had lifted, the restraints were gone, and that corporations, which know only one word, which is more, would keep pushing until there was a backlash. And as we were ending the book, Zuccotti Park emerged. And Joe flew out from Portland, Oregon, and the last chapter is out of Zuccotti. It illustrated all the points we were trying to make, which is that the formal mechanisms of power are broken. They're not going to save us. The only thing we have left are acts of civil disobedience. And I want to end just by reading a little section of the book. And this is when my friend Cornel West and I held a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs in Zuccotti Park. And we brought to that hearing New York City public school teachers who had been laid off, families who had lost their homes and were in homeless shelters, and then several hundred of us marched on Goldman Sachs. Faces appeared to me. Moments before protesters from Occupy Wall Street and I were arrested on a windy November afternoon in front of Goldman Sachs. They were not the faces of the smug Goldman Sachs employees who peered at us through the revolving glass doors and lobby windows, a pathetic collection of middle-aged fraternity and sorority members. They were not the faces of the blue uniform police with their dangling plastic handcuffs, or the thuggish Goldman Sachs security personnel whose buzz cuts and dead eyes reminded me of the Stasi. They were not the faces of the demonstrators around me, the ones with massive student debts and no jobs, the ones weighed down by their broken dreams, the ones whose anger and betrayal triggered the street demonstrations and occupations for justice. They were not the faces of the onlookers, the construction workers who seemed cheered by the march on Goldman Sachs, or the suited businessmen who did not. They were faraway faces. They were the faces of children dying. They were tiny, confused, bewildered faces I had seen in the southern Sudan, Gaza, the slums of Brazzaville, Nairobi, Cairo, Delhi, and the wars I covered. They were faces with large glassy eyes above bloated bellies. They were the small faces of children convulsed by the ravages of starvation and disease. I carry these faces. They do not leave me. I look at my own children and cannot forget them, these other children who never had a chance. War brings with it a host of horrors, but the worst is always the human detritus that war and famine leave behind, the small, frail bodies whose tangled limbs and vacant eyes condemn us all. The wealthy and the powerful, the ones behind the glass at Goldman Sachs laughed and snapped pictures of us as if we were an odd lunchtime diversion from commodities trading, from hoarding and profit, from the collective sickness of money worship, as if we were creatures in a cage, which in fact we soon were. Goldman Sachs Commodities Index is the most heavily traded in the world. The financial firm hoards futures of rice, wheat, corn, sugar, and livestock, and jacks up commodity prices by as much as 200% on the global market, so that poor families can no longer afford basic staples and literally starve. Hundreds of millions of poor in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America do not have enough to eat in order to feed this mania for profit. The technical jargon, learned in business schools and on trading floors, effectively masks the reality of what is happening: murder. The cold, neutral words of business and commerce are designed to make systems operate, even systems of death, with a ruthless efficiency. The people behind the windows and those of us with arms locked in a circle on the concrete outside did not speak the same language. Profit, trade, speculation, globalization, war, national security. These are the words they use to justify the snuffing out of tiny lives, acts of radical evil. The glass tower before us is filled with people carefully selected for the polish and self-assurance that come with having been formed in institutions of privilege. Their primary attributes are a lack of consciousness, a penchant for deception, aggressiveness, a worship of money, and an incapacity for empathy or remorse. It is always the respectable classes, the polished Ivy League graduates, the prep school boys and girls who grew up in Greenwich, Connecticut, or Short Hills, New Jersey, who are the most susceptible to evil. To be intelligent, as many are, at least in a narrow, analytical way, is morally neutral. These respectable citizens are inculcated in their elitist ghettos with values and norms, including pious acts of charity used to justify their privilege and a belief in the innate goodness of American power. They are trained to pay deference to systems of authority. They are taught to believe in their own goodness, unable to see or comprehend, and perhaps are indifferent to, the cruelty inflicted on others by the exclusive systems they serve. And as norms change, as the world is steadily transformed by corporate forces into a small cobble of predators and a vast herd of human prey, these elites seamlessly replace one set of values with another. These elites obey the rules, they make the system work, and they are rewarded for this. In return, they do not question. We seem to have lost, at least until the advent of the Occupy Wall Street movement, not only all personal responsibility, but all capacity for personal judgment. Corporate culture absolves all of responsibility. This is part of its appeal. It relieves all from moral choice. There is an unequivocal acceptance of principles such as unregulated capitalism and globalization as a kind of natural law. The steady march of corporate capitalism requires a passive acceptance of new laws and demolished regulations, of bailouts in the trillions of dollars, and the systematic looting of public funds, of lies and deceit. The corporate culture epitomized by Goldman Sachs has seeped into our classrooms, our newsrooms, our entertainment systems, and our consciousness. This corporate culture has stripped us of the right to express ourselves outside of the narrow confines of the established political order. We are forced to surrender our voice. Corporate culture serves a faceless system. It is, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the rule of nobody, and for this very reason, perhaps the least human and most cruel form of rulership. Those who resist, the doubters, outcasts, artists, renegades, skeptics, and rebels, rarely come from the elite. They ask different questions. They seek something else, a life of meaning. They have grasped Immanuel Kant's dictum, if justice perishes, human life on earth has lost its meaning. And in their search, they come to the conclusion that, as Socrates said, it is better to suffer wrong than to do wrong. This conclusion makes a leap into the moral. It refuses to place a monetary value on human life. It acknowledges human life, indeed all life, as sacred. And this is why, as Arendt points out, the only morally reliable people are not those who say this is wrong or this should not be done, but those who say, I can't. The greatest evildoers are those who don't remember because they have never given thought to the matter. Without remembrance, nothing can hold them back, Arendt wrote. For human beings, thinking of past matters means moving in the dimension of depth, striking roots, and thus stabilizing ourselves so as not to be swept away by whatever may occur, the zeitgeist or history or simple temptation. The greatest evil is not radical. It has no roots. And because it has no roots, it has no limitations. It can go to unthinkable extremes and sweep over the whole world. There are streaks in my lungs, traces of the tuberculosis I picked up around hundreds of dying Sudanese during the famine I covered as a foreign correspondent. I was strong and privileged and fought off the disease. They were not and did not. The bodies, most of them children, were dumped into hastily dug mass graves. The scars I carry within me are the whispers of these dead. They are the faint marks of those who never had a chance to become men or women, to fall in love and have children of their own. I carried these scars to the doors of Goldman Sachs. I placed myself at the feet of these commodity traders to call for justice because the dead and those dying in slums and refugee camps across the planet could not make the journey. I see their faces. They haunt me in the day and come to me in the dark. They force me to remember, and they make me choose sides. Thank you.